Hello and welcome back to another episode of Sideline Stories. I'm your host, Chase McTaggart, and today we have a very special guest. We have the Chief Creative Officer of Big Creative, Jon Willey. How are we doing today, John? Glad to have you.
Good, good. How are you? Thanks for having me, Chase.
I'm doing great. Like I said, happy to have you. Ready to get into this. It'll be a
Yeah,
a great conversation for sure.
let's do it.
Kind of jumping into the beginning of your career. I noticed that, you started out as an athletic trainer. You got a lot of experience, especially at Washington State University. That's where you got your start as graduate assistant. What kind of made you take that jump from athletic training into media? It's quite a jump.
Yeah. So I was always a photographer, and always a creative. I've been an artist my whole life since I remember. I still have pictures that I was drawing back in the early '80s, that I have of like Michael Jordan and my dad. You know, my dad was in the army, and we moved around all the time, and he was jumping out of airplanes, and like he was an Army Ranger, and so I was drawing these really cool, stuff of the military and really into that. And then I started, he went. He went into war when we were living. He was in war a couple times, but it was in the Iraq War. And some friends of our families, she happened to be the head of photography for U.S. News and World Report, which was a magazine that was a pretty big news magazine back in the day. Her name was Linda Creighton, and she was the photography chief there. And she asked if she could come do a story on our family because my dad was over in Iraq and fighting in this war, and we didn't know much about it. It was going on. No social media back then, obviously, or anything. And I think I was in 5th, 6th grade. So I had, she came in and she had this camera, this Nikon F4, I think it was, and it was a beast. This thing was, you could have the same frame rate as we do digitally now on some of them, but it was 36 rolls, shots of film. And so she came in, and I asked, and my mom helped me ask because I was a little shy, if I could tag along with her and shadow her for the week that she was in town in Hinesville, Georgia was where we are. My dad was assigned at Fort Stewart, Georgia, at the 24th Infantry Division there. And so she goes, absolutely. And so that was my first taste of understanding what photojournalism was, and I fell in love with it. Long story short, the TLDR of this was that my parents got me a camera. We were living in El Paso, Texas, and my dad was commanding the 7th Ranger Training Battalion out there, which was super cool because these are the best, in the military that you have. And they were all these things that I could go out to, and they were firing tanks and blowing up tanks and training. And sometimes they would do these exhibitions for the families out in the field. And I used to take my camera out there and I'd shoot it and I'd make these. I still have some of them, which is crazy. Photo collages. And these days we do it on our desktops.
Right.
And that was printing it out back then and going to the store and going to the pharmacy or wherever it was to get, the film printed, and you didn't know what you had. It was a different world back then, but man, was I in love with it. And so I said, photography is really interesting because I'm an artist, and I was an artist with my hands and doing a lot of charcoal. And I did black and white photography because I was colorblind. Or black and white art because I was colorblind. And so when I realized that I could get into photography and I could help tell stories and create these stories, and ultimately my goal in life was to be a Disney animator. That's what I really wanted to be. But
Wow.
the older I got, in high school, the older I got, I realized my lack of color, of vision. I see all the, when people ask what's it like to be colorblind, I was like, I see all the colors that you do. I just don't interpret them the same way you do.
Right.
I don't see the world in black and white. Some people do, but I don't. I see the full color. It's beautiful, everything that I see, the whole entire spectrums. But my brain doesn't quite send the same signals to, or my eyes don't send the same signals to my brain. So I have trouble, telling certain shades of certain things. So I said, oh, photography, I don't need to tell it. When I was drawing, I did an internship, which this kind of started the medical side for me. It was a Red Cross internship at a hospital. And I
Nice.
worked in the medical illustrator's office, and that was really cool. But they were doing, it was like we're going into surgeries and we're watching it and we're drawing it. That's how they did it back then. It was they were drawing these surgeries and these techniques that were being used. And so I was like, oh man, this is amazing, but I can tell you if that's a purple vein or a blue vein.
Right.
And so that was a problem, And so I said, okay, photography would be amazing because I don't need to see color to take pictures. And a lot of people that I talk to these days are like, "How are you a photographer? You're colorblind." I was like, "I don't need to see color to take pictures. I need to see light and shadow," which is why we can get into this a little later, which is why I started shooting a lot in black and white with the Leica and some of the stuff that I was doing in the monochrome world and bringing that into the NFL. Nobody was doing any of that in the NFL in the mid to 2020s. So that was kind of my foray into it. I was that was my first touch with when Linda Creighton I got the photography bug, and then I became an athletic trainer and went to school for that because I started pre-med, and that was because of ER, it was my favorite show back in the day, and Noah Wiley was my favorite, and it's ironic now that he stars in Pitt, which is literally based about 10 miles away from my house here.
Wow.
And
It's a very popular
Allegheny
show
General
too.
Hospital. It was so good, and I just recently watched it with my girlfriend. But that was that was what got me into wanting to be a doctor. And my dad had been to West Point, so I could have gone to West Point if I would have had the grades, and I had the grades, but I didn't necessarily have everything else that I wanted to be in the military, and my color blindness was going to stop me because I wanted to be an orthopedic surgeon. And so I was like, okay, I'm getting in my freshman year at Taylor University, a small little school in Indiana. I said, okay, I know that I want to do medicine of some sort, but I don't want to do pre-med because organic chemistry got me. And I was still taking pictures. I was in a band. I've been a drummer forever. So the creativity side kept like nagging at me and kept pulling at me for a long time. And so I decided to change my major, something a little easier, and went into sports medicine and athletic training. Wasn't that much easier. It was very hard, but I enjoyed it because I was hands-on. I wanted to do something hands-on in medicine right away. And so, again, another long story short, fast forward, I was at Bowling Green, Ohio. I was an athletic trainer, my first full-time job. I was an assistant there. Urban Meyer was the head coach at that point. He had just got hired on, and this was before the legacy of amazing Urban Meyer and how amazing he was. And, I was working on the hockey team as the athletic trainer. We had Kevin Bieksa and the Sigalette brothers, all who went on to have just amazing NHL careers.
That's awesome.
And so I was taking care of these guys, but I was like, okay, I need to start taking pictures again. The digital world was out there. It had just started, much more accessible to get into the digital world. And so I was like, okay, why don't I pitch the Ohio Athletic Trainers Association on making me the because I didn't have any money. I was making about 30 grand at that point, which in 2003 was not horrible. You couldn't even begin to think of living in this day and age on that, but
Right. Yeah.
it was tight, but rent was $600 a month for a condo, back then. So a whole different world that we lived in.
For sure. Yeah.
And so I said, okay, I can't afford digital photography equipment right now, but maybe if they do this, they'll be able to fund some, and then I can go around and then I can get access because I know people, and I know the athletic trainers for the Cleveland Browns, and I know the athletic trainers for the Columbus Blue Jackets. And so I got access to come in, and it's kind of funny looking back on it because I was pitching hard. I was a hard salesman at that point, which is not who I am. But it is when it's something that I really want to do and I'm passionate about. And so I got them to, say, hey, let's make you the photographer and we'll buy you some gear. And it just started to get me in, and I got on the sidelines and I started telling stories of athletic trainers. And while I was doing that, I was able to shoot some action as well. And it was a lot easier to get credentialed back then. Maybe not a lot easier, but with having the Athletic Trainers Association as a backing helped me, because it's just like the number one question that I get now is, how do you get a job like this? How do you get into the sidelines? How do I get credentialed? People just want to get credentialed to shoot, so they can build with a portfolio. And I was like, I'd much rather you shoot, a peewee football game and make amazing pictures that you can do. Heinz Klutmeyer actually was, legendary Sports Illustrated photographer. And I remember, learning from a lot of these guys who were just absolute legends, and they were coming through during my early time as an athletic, or as the team photographer at the Arizona Diamondbacks. And they were telling me, John, they didn't even necessarily tell me directly, but they were saying this as they were talking. I make better images at my kids' sporting events than I do at a Major League Baseball game or in the NFL. And because it's so clean, your backgrounds are so clean, and you have the joy of sport versus the joy of sport for making money. You're
Right.
doing it for sport. And so, that is, that is a little bit of a tangent into that. But then, as I was working for, I got a job I was in Phoenix. I had worked at ASU, so I followed my boss out from Bowling Green to ASU. He became the head athletic trainer there, brought me out there, and I worked the track and field team, which was legendary because they were just, Washington State has always put on one of the best. They've, I was working with Dan O'Brien, who was a hero of mine, a Olympic gold medalist in the decathlon, and he was literally sitting there taping his ankles,
Huh,
every day
that's
as he's
awesome.
prepping. And Bernard Lagat, some of the best distance runners in the world, were there at that point, and they just had a legendary. So I was like, okay, this is really cool, and I'm going to be able to tell some really cool stories. And so while I was at, or that was at Washington State. But then I was at Arizona State, and it was the same thing. It was just the top athletes in the world were there at Arizona State as track athletes, and I was working with track, and I was working with football, and I had met this guy Jason Wise, and he was the team photographer. He was the school photographer for ASU. Great dude, just a super salt of the earth guy. And he took me under his wing, and I said, "Now I really want to learn about photography. I have a lot of time sitting at events, especially track events all over the world. At that point, when we were in the Pac-10, and so I said, "Hey, I'd love to get into." Photography, and I've been doing it as kind of a side business for a while. Shot some weddings and what everybody starts in, right?
Right.
But I was working in sports, and I was like, somehow there's got to be a way for me to combine these two things that I love doing, and I knew it was because that was what Jason was doing. He was a sports photographer, and then I got the chance to work with Blair Bunting, who, if you Google Blair Bunting, you'll see his work, and he's just one of the premier commercial photographers in the country. He did the entire Discovery Channel. He has the Discovery Channel
Wow.
contract, and did all of these amazing shoots for the Dangerous Catch and all their crew, and his uncle happened to be one of the first names on the Photoshop credits, and so he had this. He was at Adobe, and so he had this family connection into Adobe, and he was doing things in Photoshop and that you couldn't believe, and he was one of the first guys who was doing some really, really talented, not one of the first I knew, who's doing some really, really amazing, not only lighting work and making it come out of camera looking really well, but also post-production work and editing. And this was when you had to do it all. We didn't have Nano Banana. We had none of it back then, and so a different world where you learned every single intimate aspect of it, and masking player images and doing all this stuff by hand versus rotoscoping automatically in 2 seconds. So there's a lot of things that I was learning at that time that put me, I think, ahead of the curve. And so this is where the inflection point came in. And I know I'm talking a lot about this, but
No problem.
it was
I
really,
love when guests, just ramble. It's
yeah.
great for storytelling. Gives us a lot of information.
Yeah, it is, and I will talk your ear off forever. But I was sitting. I vividly remember this. I was I had gotten a job as the head athletic trainer. I left ASU and got the Arizona, or the Phoenix Roadrunners was an ECHL team. They just came back. They were just bringing them back. They were an iconic ECHL team. I think they were in the AHL prior, but when they were there, and they brought them back in the ECHL, and they were going to be playing out of the arena downtown where the Suns played. The Coyotes had just moved out, so they wanted to bring in another team to come in. And this was a cool opportunity, and they recruited me to be the head athletic trainer for them. And I took the job. It was great. Nice pay raise. But the way it worked was that I was, I was a contractor for this clinic called Physiotherapy Associates, which was awesome. They were so good to work for and work with. But I was a contractor for the team, that was one of those times where in the off season, just because of the rules of being an athletic trainer and some licenses mean different things in different states, I couldn't do much because I was a glorified in a clinic. I was a glorified ultrasound tech for the summers, and I was bored, so bored. I was coming in from working all these sporting events all the time. This was my life, and high end collegiate events, and then I was going from a minor league hockey season, which was just unbelievable. The memories I have for that, I'll never forget. When you're traveling on a bus around the country with minor league hockey players, if you've ever watched Letterkenny or Shoresy, you'll understand it. Two of my favorite shows that my best friend got me onto. But that was it was a time where in the off season I was kind of like, there's got to be something better. There's got to be something better for me. Like, I love athletic training. I love being an athletic trainer, and I love sports medicine, but I need to do the creative thing. And so I remember I had this pen, and weirdly, it was a lot like this. And I used to just sit there and twirl it, and I would sit there and just line it up. And that's how bored I was, during the day in this clinic. I was lining up the pens with the corners for zero reason other than probably some sort of ADHD.
Keep the brain stimulated or something.
Yeah, exactly. And I went to the bathroom and I looked at my phone and I saw an email from the Arizona Diamondbacks, which happened to be under the same ownership, right? So Jerry Colangelo at that point, it was 2005, I think, late 2005, was just selling his interest in the Arizona Diamondbacks. They were still under the same email system as the Phoenix Suns and the Roadrunners, who I was working for at that time. And so I had gotten all the emails because we're all in the same system. Email for a photo archivist at the Arizona Diamondbacks, and that caught my eye. And so I was like, interesting. I wonder if I have any shot at this, number one. And number two, I'm going to make myself have a good shot at this. And so I'd applied for it and put in a really, really crappy portfolio that I still have to this day to look back on to say, this is where you were and this is where you can come. This is who you can become no matter what portfolio you have. And so there was, it was a really cool time. And it was so ironic that I was down in Fort Lauderdale for there's so many funny side stories, and it's aging me. But I was in Fort Lauderdale for a professional hockey athletic trainers. We called it P-Hats, and it was a symposium there, basically a conference for all the professional hockey athletic trainers to get down and spend some time together and do the whole thing like any other conference would be.
Just networking.
Yeah, networking and then new products, right? New products were coming out, and I will tell you the story because it's a funny one. But we were at the pool, hanging out in Fort Lauderdale, and all talking and having like a get together. And there was this company. They came out and they started handing out these shoes, and they had boxes of these shoes. And we opened them up, and we were like, they were plastic. What are these plastic clog looking shoes? Nobody knew about them, right? Nobody knew about them. They're like, yeah, we call them Crocs. And I was like, oh, super interesting. And they're like, yeah, this is like a version 1 or a version 2 of it.
Wow.
And I remember we all wore them because they were unique, and we all wore them around the pool, and because that's where they were kind of putting them for. But they wanted to get the athletes to wear them in like locker rooms and get contracts and everything, wear them in the shower and all. We all came with the worst blisters you would ever see from walking around with him in an hour. And so we're like, this company is going to fail miserably. That's one of those, Twitter moments where you're like, oh, I should have invested.
Yeah, right.
Because look at Crocs now, and my kids, and I have 2 pair, and my teenage boys wear them like constantly. But side note, I had gotten an interview and I got a call when I was down there that night, actually, after I got introduced to Crocs, and said it was from a gentleman named Doug Alkire, who was the senior designer of the Arizona Diamondbacks, and said, we'd like to interview you. And I said, sweet. That was all I needed. I needed an interview. I needed to get in, and I needed to prove myself. And so I did, and we hit it off in the interview, and I really came in with a unique angle to it, because I said, listen, I'm not. You probably get a lot of people applying for this job who are huge fans of the Arizona Diamondbacks, huge fans of Major League Baseball. You know, the 2001, they're coming off of a World Series. This was 5 years later, so it's still pretty fresh.
Right.
Luis Gonzalez is there. You've got, you know, Randy Johnson, and it's just absolute legends. Kurt Schilling, and a lot of them were still around. Some of them were coming back, and I said, listen, I am not. I don't idolize athletes at all. I never have. My girlfriend will tell you, you know, she's a massive sports fan and I am not. And I think that put me in such a unique position to, you know, I played golf growing up and I loved golf and I was a huge Tiger Woods fan, but I wasn't like, you know, I need to meet Tiger Woods for because it's everything, or Phil Mickelson, or these guys who were legends at that point. So to me, sports was, it was paying my bills, you know, and people always used to ask me, and they still do, who's your favorite sports team? And I said, whoever's paying my bills at that point. When you work
Whoever
in
keeps the
sports.
lights on.
Yeah, that's it. And so, you know, that was a big leverage thing for me. And then I also leveraged, I said, you know, I don't idolize these guys. I'm not going to be sitting in the dugouts, and asking for autographs, because that's some of the first things they ask you when you get into, you know, those levels. And I've done interviews before where folks have, you know, been in the interview process and walking across like the bridge or something, to go back to their car, and they'll be like, where do the players park, you know, or how much will I get in the locker room? If there's one piece of advice I can give to anybody, is don't ever talk about that in an interview. You know, like, talk about that in your head with yourself, and then if you get the job, you can, you know, ask about it, but even then be really careful, because when you're in this business, professionalism is paramount. And so,
Completely.
I think that was one of the things that may have set me apart, but I was also coming in and going to take a huge pay cut. And they were wondering why I wanted to come in. And I remember the VP of HR, Marion Rhodes, actually goes, why do you want to leave? Why do you want to leave athletic training? She goes, she came from the St. Louis Cardinals, and she goes, our athletic trainer, you know, he got hundreds of thousands of dollars when we won the World Series as his bonus, you know? And I was like, yeah, but Marion, that's 1 in 32 people in the world who are getting that, you know? And not saying that I was on my way to becoming in the NFL, you know? 2 of my student trainers that I had, one of them has rings with the Vegas Golden Knights. One of them is at the New Jersey Devils as the head athletic trainer right now. And so it's just a small world when you get into it, you know? And then everybody that you grew up with becomes these high level folks in the game, which is so cool to see. But so to me, it was like, okay, I know I'm going to get this job. And if I get this job, I'm going to set myself a goal. And I said, I want to double truck in Sports Illustrated. And this was a goal. This is bucket list goals, right? Hey, there we go. I want to double truck in Sports Illustrated. And what was the other thing that I said? Oh, I said, and I want to be the team photographer for the Arizona Diamondbacks. They already had a great team photographer, Barry Gossage, who was just an amazing photographer, an amazing dude. But he was a contractor. Most of them were contractors. And so when I got hired, I said, hey, what do you guys think? You know, if we were trying to think about bringing in creatives, this was back in 2006. Not that long ago in the grand scheme of things, 20 years ago. And you know how much has changed in 20 years.
For sure.
And not only the technology landscape, but the world of sports has changed dramatically. And so, you know, for me at that point, it was, just getting my foot in the door. And then I said, why don't we bring in, you know, an in-house team of creatives? I think you can save a lot of money, because I was seeing what they were paying these agencies, millions and millions of dollars. And I said, some teams around the country are starting, it seems like, from what I could tell. Granted, Facebook didn't exist. None of this stuff existed, you know, back then. So there wasn't really like a way to talk to people like we do now without calling them and saying, what do you do? How do you do your creative? Most everybody was an agency. And so we were one of the first teams at the Diamondbacks to bring creative and photography in house, you know, and Barry would still work for us, as a contractor, but we were able to leverage internal, you know, and pay quite a bit less and have quite a bit of savings. Looking back on that, I don't know if it was the best thing, because I was trying to get my foot in the door, because salaries necessarily haven't kept up in sports creative side, but we're working on it. but that was that was my in, and I took it and ran with it, and have turned it into something really special. And I've gone through some insane ups, and some really insane downs too. But that's what happens in this world. But that's the really, really long answer of how I got into this business.
That was great, though. I mean, very detailed. Really appreciate your explanation there. It gives us a lot of understanding as to what it took to get to where you started. So now, kind of the transition from the Diamondbacks to the Dolphins. How did you end up? That's a big change all the way across country. Two different environments, still hot, arid environments, but a little
Yeah.
different. What did that look like for you? How did that kind of transpire?
Yeah, great question, and that was something that I had only known moving every year. I moved 19 times before I graduated high school. Moving to me
Wow.
was in my blood, and I would get this itch after being somewhere for a couple years, like it's time to move, and so my wife at the time. Was not that she was a stay still, and we want to plant some roots, and I agreed, and so it was but I also knew that I needed to make a move. One of the things, the biggest pieces of advice that I can give to young creatives these days is don't be afraid to move on. And don't be afraid to move on if you feel like you're not appreciative, or if you just need to make more money, because I can guarantee you that if you stay with a team, and you started out as an intern or a coordinator, you're going to be getting your 3% cost of living if you're lucky to get it, and then probably some raises along the way. But the only way to truly like bump your salary if you want it is to move to another team. And so that was something that I have figured I was going to retire in Arizona with the Diamondbacks, and a lot of folks still are, and they're doing amazing. And the Diamondbacks have just a really quality front office led by quality people. I'll always be thankful for the time I had there, because I think, I was just talking to one of my friends, John Fisher, who recently moved here to become the VP of revenue for the Pittsburgh Riverhounds. And he was there as, we both cut our teeth at the Diamondbacks. He was on the sales side, I was on this. And it's like we said, we'll never trade those memories for anything. And there's a lot of what I'm writing about in the book, the good, the bad of those times. But it's for me, it was the relationships that I had made that got me the opportunity to talk to the Miami Dolphins. And that's another big lesson here. It's that, especially as a photographer, maybe, designers don't get much of that interaction with everybody, but you have to make it intentional to get those interactions with the executives. So I became really good friends with Tom Garfinkel, who was, I believe he was like the chief revenue officer, or VP of revenue for the Diamondbacks. He left to go take a job. He's a big photography buff too, and loved it. And so he and I bonded over that. He left to take the CEO job at the Padres, and
Wow.
and then not too long after that, I knew he was going to do big things, just like Urban Meyer. I told everybody when Urban Meyer left, I said, this guy's going to win multiple national championships, zero doubt about it, and I knew Tom was going to come and shake things up, and the fact that Steve Ross then hired him at the Miami Dolphins to basically come in and make it a global entertainment destination in Miami. It's Miami, it's the Dolphins. Dan Marino wasn't even involved in the team at that point, which is a sin. No, and so bringing back these legends to bring in the fold, something Tom did really, really exceptionally, and just changing the course, and so it's funny because there are rules about tampering, just like with anybody in sports. When somebody moves internally in a team, they can't really talk to us about stealing us, to go. So the opportunity had not really been there to go to the Padres, even though I don't think I could have afforded to live in San Diego. But there was a job that I scrolled on LinkedIn, and it was for a senior director of content and creative for the Miami Dolphins. And I said, wow, if this isn't my job, I don't know what is. I was, a senior manager at that point at the Diamondbacks, running the creative department and the video department, overseeing the video department, and a little bit as well as kind of in an interim role in the game presentation department with my boss Rob at the time. And so um, I was getting all this experience and I was taking everything. I knew that if I wanted to be a creative director in sports, I needed to know how to do every role and how to do every role really, really well, because sports isn't like
Absolutely.
an agency, right? You don't have three people, a 3-person team. You have a U team. And a lot of the teams, and you're going to have maybe 5 graphic designers who are working with you, 5, 2, and five on your team total,
Right.
including your photographer and including your videography folks, and that was where we were. We had started getting more money and started getting more resources, because those things were starting to become more important with social media on the precipice and just kind of peeking its head out with YouTube and everything. And so we I texted Tom immediately when I saw that, and I said, "What's this?" And he goes, "You want to apply?" And I think it was more of also a tampering thing. Like, I don't know that he was necessarily allowed to come ask me, if I wanted to apply for this job, hoping that I would see it, and I did see it. And this was back way before algorithms were really a thing. It was kind of like you had your timeline, and that was what it was. And that's what you saw, and that's the good old days, in my opinion. But
Times have changed for
the
sure.
times have changed, and so what that I got that job, and I came out, and he goes, "I'm going to hire you," and I actually already hired another guy. He wouldn't tell me who it was, and he goes, "But I want you to come learn from him." And he goes, "He's a high level global creative director for one of the major shoe brands, and that's what he's coming off from." And so I said, "Oh, well, that makes me nervous." There, the imposter syndrome sets in immediately, and I was like, "Wow, I'm going to the Miami Dolphins. I'm going to the NFL from the MLB. I know how Tom works. I know how Steve Ross works. I know how uh, how how much work this is going to be. I don't know if I can do this." And I got a little nervous. But I told my wife, and we had 2 young kids, 2 young boys, and they were very young, toddlers at that point. And I said, I have an opportunity at the Miami Dolphins, and we both agreed that we would go and try it out. And so I went out for a couple months beforehand, and then moved them back, moved them out there, and we had a great little neighborhood, so that helps, in the transition as we moved out. But I was working my ass off, and as to be expected in that situation, I was the team photographer, and I was rebuilding an entire creative department, or building. I shouldn't say rebuilding. I was building an entire creative department. They had a small one there before with some really talented creatives, and a lot of them hung out, and some of them left, and there was a little bit of turnover, and but we were, I was coming in to learn from Surf Melendez, who that gentleman, who went on to become the VP of creative for the Titans, and then most recently he's out as the executive creative director for the Arizona Cardinals. Still, one of my closest friends, and we have a great partnership with them through Big Creative this year,
That's
and
awesome.
so. That was it. It's all about the point of this story being, it's all about who you know, and it's
Totally.
but who comes from the relationships that you develop. Because if you just come in grumpy every day, you don't like doing it, you're complaining about your salary, you're complaining about the hours, you're complaining about having to wear a polo or a suit and tie if you work in the NHL, every day, and it it people see that. So I'm not saying to fake it. Don't come in and fake it. Be who you are. But just know that you need to make those relationships, and make those people relationships. And that relationship with Tom is something that, is along with the work that I did, obviously, but having that relationship got me where I am today.
I think, like you said, networking is incredibly important. And I just kind of wanted to stem back to something you said in the middle of your story about, how working with a large team and how it can be like a lot of work. Something that you talk about on your blog post, and also I noticed that you have Creative AF, which is
Yeah.
something that you founded as well, but
Yep.
is mental health and burnout, and kind of
Yeah.
the result of that from working in sports, and how it's such a high intensity field. What could you say about what it means for you, as far as what it looked like, dealing with these kind of this large amount of stress throughout your career, how you dealt with it, and also advice for other people out there who may be dealing with the same kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I, as you noted, I'm writing a lot about this right now, and it's become very therapeutic for me. And
I
it's
love
been
your stuff, by the way. It's
Thank
great,
you.
great
I
read.
appreciate that. And it's trying to put, I've wanted to write this book, and I wanted to write a blog or something like this for a long time. That's why I started Creative AF. And I mean, to me, it was a little play on words. It was creative. AF obviously means as fuck, but it was kind of like that. But I was kind of, if people asked me and they're like, "What does the AF mean?" I was like, "And fucked." So it was a mental health podcast because we were creatives and we're fucked because we're working in sports, and it's stealing the soul from us,
Totally.
for to put butts in seats. I saw it happening so much. And if you listen to the podcasts with Will, my business partner now, with Sammy Silverman, just an absolute legendary graphic designer who was the core of Ohio State for a long time, and so many folks that I talked to on that podcast, who went through it, and who had to figure out why they were in it, because initially why we're in it because we're super fans, right? Sammy's a massive super fan of the Ohio State Buckeyes, and does some of the most amazing work for them still, even just conceptually. And I know he's still works for them a lot, but it had to become, as I talk about in that podcast with Sammy, it was a there was so much of an ego play, when it comes into sports, and there is no feeling like walking out onto a field, unfettered access, and there's 110,000 people around you screaming.
I'm sure it's
Like,
thrilling.
it's unbelievable how that feels. And the first time I went to a Diamondbacks game, I felt that. And I had been to many college games before. I'd been to many professional games before, but as an athletic trainer, and it's a whole different vibe, right? You still get it. You still get the buzz. But this to me was, I had now broken into the major leagues, for lack of a better term, to the NFL and to that. And so, my first experience with, my mental health, I never even, like, we didn't talk about mental health back in the day.
Right.
It wasn't a coined term. My mom and I talked about this for a while, 'cause she had been on some early, um, medicine tests because of her anxiety, and her panic. Those are things that I never found out till I was 40 years old, because we didn't talk about that stuff. And social media was making that a little more prevalent, but I was struggling. There was a time at the Diamondbacks. It's funny. I literally was just having the story with John Fisher, in the last hour, and where it was, I don't even know when it was, 2011 probably. We had hosted the All-Star game. That was 2 years of work for 2 weeks of nonstop work for a Major League Baseball All-Star game, and one of the best experiences that I've ever had, with my team and the teams there, and working with Major League Baseball front
Awesome.
office, and but man, was it affecting me, and I didn't realize it. And I was going home, and I was grumpy, and I had 2 toddlers, and nobody was sleeping, and I was coming home from getting champagne poured all over me in a clubhouse, and we were, a game away from going to the World Series type thing, and life was unbelievable, on the outside. And then you go home, and it's the dichotomy of who you are. The players are going to go home to their mansions. The front office folks are not, and
Right.
they're going home to their starter homes with their kids, and they're eating ramen, and they're struggling to make it through. And so it all just kind of hit me, at some point, because I was trying to do everything for everybody, and that's not good leadership. It's actually really, really bad leadership, when you do that. And that was a note to self, and a really defining moment in mine when I was breaking down in tears. I'm not that person, I'm an emotional person, but I was breaking down in tears in a stairwell at Chase Field, and texting my boss to say, I need help. I can't do this, and because I pulled an all-nighter because we had a 5 a.m. D-backs 5K race the next morning, and I was putting signage up everywhere, and my boss had left to go move on to another role, and I was doing everything at that point. And I had an amazing team that was helping me, but they had lives too,
Right.
and so I said, I need to let them live my life so I can make sure that we put out the best product that we can for these things. And it all came to a head. And that was one of the decisions that I said, oh, I'm going to look for something else. And didn't really actively start looking for anything because it's really hard when you're a niche in this world of sports. People outside don't necessarily see what we do in sports as transferable to an agency or transferable to, corporate America. A lot of it the other way around. People see that you could do that, but they don't see, there's a stigma against a lot of us who work in sports and trying to find something outside of the actual arena or the stadium. And so, I was hit hard and then went to Miami. It was trying to be a fresh start, but man, that was probably 10 times worse. Not from like necessarily a mental health perspective, outwardly, but it was just the level that we always used to say every Sunday is a Super Bowl, and I hear a lot of the NFL teams say that now, and I not heard that before because until Tom had told us in one of our all staff meetings when he first took the job, and it's like every Sunday is a Super Bowl. It's our Super Bowl. We may never make the Super Bowl. They haven't yet, but every Sunday is our Super Bowl, and that's how you had to look at it. And so we put in the effort, and we had these amazing people that were working on it. My business partner now, Will, and my best friend included, and we were all making, we were all busting our asses to put the best. It was early social media. We were working with Gary Vaynerchuk and VaynerMedia, which was super cool because they were, partly owned by the Raw Sports initiative, and so there was a lot of amazing work that was being done, and we were breaking molds. And like I talked about the black and white photography earlier, we were doing things that people were like, wow, why would you do that? Why are you doing that? Why are you sending pictures of your players boarding planes? And I remember Vince, who was he was our social media director back then, and he went on to an amazing career at Facebook, and now he's the VP of content for the UFL, working with The
Wow.
Rock there and doing amazing work there. But I remember he said, because we sold a sponsorship for it, or we will sell a sponsorship for it. And that was the first time that I mean, sponsorships were always a huge thing for me, but that was like, oh, we're entering a new phase of this,
Mm.
because people are going to pay for impressions now. And that wasn't being done before. There was no paid social. And so now we were like, okay, we have to come up with all these ways to make more revenue. So that's what our job was, right? That's what everybody's job is in sports, is how do you make the most revenue?
Right.
And so that was, it was a ton. All that to be said, it was working concerts, and I just remember, I really hit another breaking point at the Dolphins when I think it was either U2 or Metallica, which is just to say that I was photographing one of their concerts at Hard Rock Stadium is cool. Two bands that I idolized growing up.
Yeah,
I
that's
am a
awesome.
musician, so I actually did kind of idolize musicians because I loved them and I wanted to be that. And I was walking out of this concert. It was probably 1 in the morning after I edited. And we had a 5 a.m. Call time for media day the next morning. And it was in Davie, Florida, which was 10 miles north. It was near my house, but I had to lug all of my gear, because I'd been so busy, and we had a lot of it there, but I had some gear that I was using, and I was lugging it out through these dirt parking lots and walking like, half a mile to get to my car because of changing a lot of the stuff that we did, and employees never necessarily get to park close anyway, and so
Right.
I was just like, oh man, this is breaking me and I have to figure something out, and so at that point I just really had to look at myself and my mental health and say I have to begin to put this first. And I was making decisions I wasn't happy about. I was making decisions that were not me, because I talk about that story about flying on charter jets to London, and flying back home, and hoping that I would catch my kids before they hopped on the bus that morning because I hadn't seen them in 2 weeks, and then going back and having Cheerios for breakfast instead of the full spread in front of you that you had every single day, and NFL catered to you, and more food than you can ever imagine. The perks, you began to live these two lives, for lack of a better term, and I was deep in it. And so then I ended up getting a therapist. And that was the first time that I had ever, it was like, it was a stigma against that. And I had people who were like, like one of my friends who was a trainer, not like an athletic trainer, but like a personal trainer, was like, you don't need that stuff. You don't need, let's just work out more, and let's do things. There's so many things you can do for your mental health. And then God forbid you ever want to take medicine for it. And that was the first time in my life I realized this is, bringing my medical background into this a little bit. This is a medical issue. This is the signals that are going to my brain are not saying the right things, and I need to help them, or they're overpowering me, right? And they're giving me this. I didn't understand. I thought it was normal for me to have conversations with my team and to be shaking the entire time. And I thought that was normal. I
Wow.
didn't like public speaking. I didn't like that sort of thing. So I was like, okay, this is just who it is, or having to give people bad news because I didn't want them to not like me, because I was a people pleaser and I wanted everybody to like me. And my therapist, I remember vividly, told me, listen, if you want to be a CEO one day, or a CCO or anything one day, you're going to have to be okay with people not liking you. Not everybody's going to like you. That's it. It's a pie in the sky thing. And so, for me, that was what I needed to hear, because that's a slow burn process, though. Like, that takes a while to break, decades. I had a 40. This was my midlife crisis. I put my earrings back in from college. I got more tattoos all over my my body, because I was like, oh, I get to actually do things that are for me, and I have this. What's called agency, right? If you've done any research on what personal agency is versus the other kind of agency, it just means that you can make every decision that you want.
Right.
You can do it, and you just have to be able to handle the consequences of that, which I've seen in my life a lot, especially in the past decade. But every single one of those decisions that you make is affecting your mental health, and I didn't realize it. And so it was just making sure that I was understanding it. And as a former scientist and someone who worked in that field, my brain still thinks in that kind of scientific method way.
For sure.
Whereas, like, oh, here's what it is, here's the hypothesis, and here's how we need to get there. And then we need to do some testing on it. So for me, it was like, okay, what do I need to do? Do I need to test, with THC? Do I need to test with, Wellbutrin, which they put me on? And what are some of those things? But then it's breaking decades of religious trauma. And I use the term trauma very loosely, right? It's kind of a cliche thing, but I was brought up very Christian, in a Christian family. It's still amazing, and I wouldn't trade it for anything. But I also, was deconstructing from that, because I was like, wow, I was living my life for this for God, in Jesus, and not living my life for me necessarily, or my family, when I had to be the best who I could for myself in order to be the best for my family, and I wasn't doing it. So I was failing on a lot of things there. And so, that was one of the impetus behind, just happened to fall into place, that I was really, really in a dark spot at the Dolphins, after about 5 years there. And I figured I didn't know what I was going to do, but I needed to get out somehow. And it was really hard for me to do that, because I had to break some friendships. And it sucks. I didn't want those friendships to break, especially at the top level. But that happens, and that's life. And I had to say, it's okay. Not everybody's gonna like me, but I have to take care of my own mental health, in order to do this.
Absolutely.
And so, had the opportunity, an amazing opportunity, to partner up with, Tom Eriks, who was one of the early Facebook, he's employee number 100 there, and did some really amazing things, there, and retired after the IPO, and wanted to help fund, mostly silently fund, some purpose-driven mental health, like a production company. And so I got with him. We started in sports, and then we realized the total market for that was very small. And so we were like, let's create this company, that is going to be a mental health platform for Gen Z. And we called it Better, and BETR, which has now been purchased by Jake Paul. I think I don't know which ones they are, but they are it is a betting company now, so about as
Right.
opposite as you could possibly get.
Yeah, I
Um,
was interested in that because it's a quite a switch up. But I mean, hey, at the end of the day, once it's sold, and you don't
yeah,
have any control over
yeah,
that. But
yeah,
I mean, quite an incredible company to be founding, especially because the meaning behind it. There's a cause, there's an objective, which is to help people. And I think it's kind of interesting, almost how it's been flipped on its head, and now
yeah,
it's a betting company that
right,
is enabling almost problems
yeah.
instead of solving them. Um,
It's weird how our
but
world
here
works
nor there.
sometimes. Yeah, exactly. And so, wrapping up the story about mental health. Unfortunately, COVID hit, and when it's the kind of the irony of the world these days is when the world needs it the most. Um, you can't continue because all your partners pulled out and you need money to run a company. And Tom had put in so much of his own money. It was so generous with what he was building with us. We had a team of 18 that we built quickly because we knew we needed to create content, content, and content, and content. We hired, Nick Conklin from Clemson, who was doing amazing work. He was just an icon in this. We hired, Tommy King to run the content program there, and we just had some. Chris Liskowitz was the creative director who had worked with the Panthers and multiple teams, and is with CCA now, and just some really amazing people. And it
You
sucked.
assembled the Avengers of the
We
sports
did.
media world, it sounds like.
It was amazing. And it was also amazing for people to come and get some experience outside of sports. And when you do that, I have a whole chapter in the book about the silence after sports. And it's
Right.
really deafening. It's very deafening because what we're used to is run, 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 run all the time. And when you actually have a weekend that you don't have anything to do, you're like, I'm doing something wrong.
Yeah, you
Um,
feel like you're like, what am I doing? I gotta
yeah,
move, move, move,
yeah,
go, go.
I have to go. I will to this day still feel something inside saying I shouldn't sit on the couch and watch my shows, or have a Saturday where I just binge Breaking Bad, or something like that. And it's like I'm doing much better about it, but it's still something that's there. And it's something that I talk to a lot of people about, and it's one of the hardest things about getting out of sports. But when you realize that, oh wow, you can actually have a life outside of this, it's really cool to see. And I think the whole reason for the writing and that I'm doing now is to say both can happen. You can have a life and still work in sports in the front office, and we're doing it differently with Big, creative, in that we've all been there. We've all been, the five of us who are on our team have been in the trenches. Four of us have worked at the Dolphins, and one of them was with the Arizona Coyotes, which that organization alone was really interesting. But it takes some time to break out
For sure.
of and I will call it trauma, because everything is some sort of trauma, right? Whether it's good or bad, it's traumatic to our sensory nervous system and everything. And you are trying to break out of some of those habits that are hard to learn. But once you do and you realize that you can do both, it's really freeing.
I agree completely. I mean, obviously that'll be at the tail end of my career. I'm, just getting started, but I
Yeah.
do completely understand these things, and that it's kind of the nature of how it works.
Yeah,
I
definitely.
did want to get into, and I will say I don't have a lot of time just because I have to hop down to the studio with my fellow classmates. We're producing our own show. Keep an eye out
Awesome.
for Bet Zone.
Love it.
But anyways, I did want to talk about industry trends and kind of where things are going. We live in quite a crazy world considering, we have AI, all this stuff, all these generative applications. What do you see as far as the future of creative and, the future for content creators? Like, what does it look like? Will there be reduced jobs? Like, what does it look like? What do you think?
I you know I am not sure what we're going to see because, I was in the same conversation that I was just having the last hour. We talked about that. I've given some presentations on ethical use, and it's all my opinions, right, of AI, how much I use AI. And I don't think it's, I have some friends, Brandon Moore in particular, and some folks that I've worked with who are iconic designers, who are very outspoken about it and the issues that they're seeing with it, and they're right. They're right on all of it, but a lot of it for me is learning, just like with anything, right? Like it's the printing press folks saying, we're not going to use these computers. Why are we going to use these computers to create our newspaper every day? We have a printing press. It's amazing. This is what we've done forever, right? The minute you say this is what we've done forever, then you know you have a problem, and you know you're not willing to move forward. So you
Right.
have to attack it, right? You have to attack it. Like there's so many things that I'm trying to think back to. And I was one of the early users of Procreate on it, to draw. And I was like, this actually allows me to draw without having to get all my charcoal out, make a huge mess, make everybody mad because I'm making a mess all over the kitchen table. I knew this was going to be a game changer, and I was chomping at the bit in line for that Apple Pencil when it came out, because it came out so far after that. I was working with Procreate, I was talking with them, and they were hiring me to do some things, and I drew a picture of Jarvis Landry because I'm a hyperrealism artist, and it won their first Procreate grand prize that they ever gave out.
Wow.
And that was really cool to me. And so I was like, okay, that is, and some people are like, that's not art. And I was like, no, I literally did the same thing. I just drew it on a tablet versus a tablet of paper. I drew on an electronic tablet versus a tablet of paper. The skill set was still there. It's still the same. But what it did was it made me more efficient, and it made me want to get more done. And so that's what I think we have to look at. And I think there's a lot of people in this world who are preaching that as well. It's like, don't even the founders of OpenAI or some things like that. And I don't want to say the wrong thing because I don't know enough about it to speak about what their visions are. But everybody's got an opinion, and for me, it is we have used it in particular. I use this example of a lot. We were asked by the Tucson Sugar Skulls and the Arizona Rattlers, same company, Arena Football League team, right? Small budget, small team, small front office, mostly volunteer folks who were working in it. And they wanted an open video. We had just finished the open video for the Raiders, and we had just finished the open video for the Panthers. Those were huge budget, things. And then, and we kind of initially said, Will and I were like, I mean, we're not going to be able to do this for you. Your budget, I think their budget was $2,500. To get 2 open videos, 2-minute long open videos. And I said, you know what? Hold on. I know an editor, and happens to be related to me, happens to be graduating high school. And this would be a great project, for him. And I said, will you guys be willing to do that if I threw this to David? And they said, absolutely. And I said, okay, David, we got to be efficient. Probably he was 17 at the time, and very well versed in the AI world. But it wasn't. We're not going to create this video like the Coke example of their commercial this year, which is made the rounds, and there's 16 different versions of the truck.
Yeah, how they didn't use AI. They got a lot of props for that, right? That's what they're talking about.
All prompts, and it was fully AI, and they hired an entire prompts team. So they probably spent the same budget as they would have spent making it, in realistic but in actual real props and everything, and real trucks, but they spent all the money to do it with AI. I don't necessarily agree. I don't think that was. I look at that commercial differently now. I look at Coke differently now because of that. But what we did at this, at the Tucson Sugar Skulls, was we needed this scene that we couldn't find on Envato. It was an Ofrenda scene with all the candles and all the lights, and we wanted to, we were just going to use Envato and Motion Array and download a bunch of the stuff from our subscription and make them a cool video with all the content that they had. It was going to be fun, $5,000, and we were like, okay, let's leverage what we need to make these scenes, and so in 5 seconds, Midjourney creates this amazing background with exactly the Ofrenda we wanted. It didn't know how to do logos back then, and that was only a year ago. And which
it's
is
crazy
fine.
how it's like evolved. Everything's just getting better and better. It's wild.
Yep. And scary at the same time, to our point of this conversation right now. But so that was one of those situations where, okay, I need to create a standard operating procedures manual for partnerships, LED ribbons for the San Francisco 49ers. And, and yes, I could sit and write out that entire thing. And what I did was I wrote out the high-end high level bullet points of what we needed to create, for the standard operating procedure. But then what I would normally do in the past, right, is go on and Google, okay, how do you create standard operating procedures? I've done a few of those before, but we don't do a lot of those in sports. And so it came down to basically, I throw everything into ChatGPT or whatever, Gemini or whatever at the time, and said, help me, act as a guide for me in this, just like you were being an editor for me or something like that. Tell me what you think about this, the good, the bad, the ugly, and then I'm going to finish writing it and go from there. That's how I think we effectively use AI, is creating a background that you may not have. Don't create the whole entire video necessarily, unless you have a sports team that has no creative budget and you have to get it done. If you're a small market team and you're an AFL team, you may need to leverage AI to make something really cool because you're just trying to get butts in seats and have a great hype opening, so don't overthink it. But also I think we're in a position where the inflection point is changing literally every day. Because to your point of what you just said, all of that stuff is changing so dramatically. You don't even know it's real anymore. There's still a sense, and people are figuring out how to take the Sora, watermarks off of their videos, and so you really don't know what's happening.
Wild.
And they're probably using AI to do that, which is, it's so funny how it's a very Inception thing. But yeah, so that's, that to me is, I think that's changing. There's no concrete answer to what's good in that, but I would tell my creative teams, like, hey, we're not putting out anything that's fully AI, but we can use it to help make our job more efficient for sure and save us time so we can go spend the time with our family.
Right. And I think that's, the overall use case for it is like it should be a vessel, like a tool that gets you from point A to point B, but it's not the end all be all.
Absolutely.
So I did want to finalize with just one question, which is what is a lesson or something that you wish every young creative could internalize early on in their career to kind of take with them through their career?
Feedback is a gift. And that's a sign that it's something that Surf brought over from Crispin Porter when he was there at a big agency, and they had that on their walls. And we had some street artists in Miami paint some big murals for us that said feedback is a gift. Not everybody understands that. The hardest thing for young creatives is to get out, to step outside of their own self. We called it, we also had stickers. It's the ugly baby syndrome. If you ever watch Seinfeld, but Janice had the baby and Janice was like, look at my baby's gorgeous, and everybody look at my baby, and Jerry and Elaine and everybody are like, oh, your baby's really ugly. The mom's never going to think their baby's ugly, right? The creative is never going to think, well, unless you're in it and you constantly talk bad about your own creative, which a lot of us do, right? Self-deprecating is a way we all handle a lot of that stuff. But the creative, when you make the work about the work, if you're designing something because you have a brief from the Arizona Diamondbacks that you need to design and this is what it needs to be, that's not your chance. That's not your time to be doing fine art. That's your time to answer a brief. When you have time that you can do fine art, do fine art. And then on top of that, when you get feedback, I used to get my photography just destroyed, and that made me so much better, and when you go, if you're in a photography program or a creative program and you go in for like a panel review or something, they will destroy you because that's their job. And that's not how I give feedback. My whole feedback philosophy, I have a whole chapter on this in the Substack, which is basically, hey, this looks awesome, I love it, or hey, what were you thinking about? What was the philosophy behind this? Not what were you thinking, but like, what were you thinking about when you were designing this? What was the philosophy behind your choices that you made here? And if it skewed away from the brief. And so giving feedback is a gift, and taking feedback is probably even a more important gift. I've had some folks say, I don't agree with you. I don't think that's right. I don't want to move to 4:5 video. I want to do widescreen with fucking letterbox on top of it for everything on social media. Oh yeah? Well, how does that look on your phone? When you're looking at it like this, and you can't turn your phone because we didn't have that technology back then. So everything is, there's a reason for the feedback most of the time. And now as a leader, don't give feedback just because you think that that's the way you want it to be done. Like if there's a brief, subjective feedback and objective feedback are two separate things, and you have to really be aware of what those mean. You'll run into a lot of folks who are like, I just don't like it, or CEO looks at it and says, I don't like it. Well, press them, ask them why, what they don't like, because just I don't like it is not what we need, to grow as creatives. And so I think, understanding feedback, taking feedback, being patient with feedback, asking a ton of questions, and as a leader, listening to them. What are they asking about? And why did they make the design decisions that they did, or the photography decisions that they did? Because there were a lot of times when I had young photographers who were, or social media folks who were putting pictures out from the dolphins, and the horizons were like, they didn't edit them, and they were off. And I would be like, hey, what was the design decision around this? Oh, we just didn't have time to get to it. Well, details are everything. Let's make the time to get to it. And if we didn't get the quarter graphic out within 2 seconds of the quarter ending, we're gonna be okay, because the algorithm's gonna mess it up anyway. So a lot of things to think about there, but that's the kind of the biggest piece of advice I would give.
I think that's a great way to end it. I appreciate, that was a great piece of advice. I did want to say, is there anything that you wanted to plug before we kind of head out of the podcast?
Yeah, I just think, I'm writing about a lot of these things on my Substack, and it's just jonwilley.substack.com, and continuing to work on the book, and I'm at Jon Willey on Twitter, and at jwilleyphoto on Instagram. And so look me up. I'd love to connect with anybody and everybody.
Absolutely. And, I think there's a lot to take away from this conversation. I appreciate your time, and I'll definitely keep in touch.
Awesome, Chase.
Lots to take away and lots to learn from you, man.
Yes, great to meet you.
Likewise.
Good
Have
luck
a good
in your
one.
class. You bet. Take care.
Thank you.